Last year in December, I went to the e-earphone portable audio festival in Tokyo, held in the heart of Tokyo in Akihabara, or Akiba as the locals refer to it. The event was held at the Berusaru Akihabara Event Center, a large building with 3 whole floors of exhibition space, and the first floor opens out to the street where you're greeted by a gigantic pair of Audio Technica headphones, which leads you into the venue where the main companies such as Sony, JVC and the like have their stalls. But on the second floor and the basement floor, there's a large CanJam-like exhibition hall full of manufacturers, from the small single-man companies up to well-known companies that we've seen for many years. And while originally the Portable Audio Festival, or Potafes as it's called, was aimed at portable audio gear only, because it's become the main event in Tokyo for headphone and earphone demonstrations, it included some desktop headphones as well. Over the 2 days I went to the festival, I tried out 20 different pairs of headphones and IEMs. Most of the earphones nowadays are quite complex, with a variety of drivers such as the classic balanced armature driver, which originated in hearing aids, dynamic drivers which are miniaturized versions of what we have in regular headphones, and what are known as electrostatic, or actually technically electret drivers, which are fairly insensitive but charged drivers, which are very good for reproducing higher frequencies where balanced armature drivers tend to have a bit of distortion. And combining all those together has become something of an art from manufacturers in recent years, and the result has been fantastic. Compared to some IEMs of a decade ago, the differences are absolutely amazing. But speaking of 10 years ago, one of the IEMs that started the whole trend of high-end IEMs with high-quality cables was the Campfire Audio Andromeda. With 5 balanced armature drivers per side, it was an instant hit and set a high bar for other manufacturers to follow. And its 10th anniversary, Campfire Audio now offers a 10-driver version with a very fancy case that was almost a little bit confusing to figure out which piece was the left and which was the right. Anyway, for this show, I brought with me Kayin's RU9 portable DAC and amp, and I loaded up my iPhone, actually Rune Arc, with some very high-res PCM and DSD files to get the maximum out of the RU9, and that saved me carrying a very bulky and complex rig and having to charge a lot of gear like I usually do at other CanJam shows. The RU9 has enough power to handle full-sized headphones as well, and even some more demanding in-ear monitors. And the overall combination was, while not maybe quite as good as maybe a top-flight DAP or the Hugo 2 I usually take to shows, it still gave me a very clear idea of the differences between different models. The list of music I used can be found in my written review on here.audio, but suffice to say, most of the time I was listening to Dead Can Dance, a live Yoko Mabuchi album of jazz, and a direct-to-DSD recording of Carmen Gomez, as well as a few other things such as regular music off Cobars and a rip of an Accuphase SACD with some classical music on it. Listening with the aforementioned Campfire Audio Andromeda 10th anniversary, Dead Can Dance's Song of the Stars reminded me how much the Andromedas are like an IEM version of Odyssey's LCDX headphones. The treble and detail were about as good as you can get for an all-balanced armature driver pair of IEMs. There was still some of that balanced armature sound to the presentation of the music, and the soundstage, like a typical all-balanced armature driver IEM, was not quite so deep and without the kind of clear and separate imaging that you do get with the best multi-driver IEMs that are available nowadays. The second manufacturer I tried was one I hadn't before, which was Visioneers, and I immediately tried their current flagship, the Zen. And from that I found that the Yoko Mabuchi live jazz album had very even space and imaging. What is more, unlike a lot of IEMs that are very V-shaped or quite coloured, it doesn't try and oversell the music by generally being evenly responsive throughout the frequency response range. It had excellent treble that isn't hot, but to me was invisible in the sense that it made me not think about the in-ear monitors themselves, but actually allowed me to appreciate the music as it was. I noticed that the subtleties of the trumpet were very clear, such as the fine nuances you get from hearing a trumpet up close, and that was very appreciable. I found that it could do everything from bass upwards very clearly and was very honest to the music, which I appreciate a lot. Definitely high marks for that one for this show. They also had a new inexpensive IEM, the Go Live. It had something of a V-shaped tuning with a bright treble, and after the Zen, of course, well, it felt a little bit unrefined, but still it's a much cheaper IEM. The new flagship that was upcoming was the Phonix. It has big bass and a bright treble, like a typical high-end IEM, very dynamic sound with everything from piano notes to dead can dance. I felt like that the fine nuances that the Zen had were sacrificed slightly for this big and bold sound. Final Audio had an entire wall dedicated to their in-ear monitors and full-sized headphones. Now, I've already reviewed the Tonalite IEM system where you scan your face and ears to get a custom-tuned sound, and they had a setup which allowed people to do the whole 30-minute process and try out the Tonalite system and see if it works for them. They also had the DX4000 CL closed-back headphones, which I'll talk about in their own review. They're a less bass, crazy version of the DX3000, and it keeps the mid-range but dials back the bass. In fact, the mid-range comes out a little bit better. It has a smooth treble without some of the harshness of internal reflections that other headphones have. Instruments still sounded a little bit distant in that setup I had with me, and so you end up with a deeper soundstage, which is a little bit narrower, and the instrument separation wasn't quite as great as I'm used to with other headphones, but again, more in the review of those. One of the interesting manufacturers I've tried before, especially last year at CanJam Singapore, was Hercules Audio and their Moses IEMs. Now, I like those IEMs, but I found that the treble was somewhat sibilant for me. Talking to the guys again, they had discovered that if they paired their Moses IEMs with the Pentacon aluminium tips, that is their silicon tips with an aluminium insert, that the sibilance all but disappears. For example, the Carmen Gomez direct-to-DSD track results in a presentation that has a gentle V sound, that is a little bit of boosted bass and a little bit of boosted treble versus neutral, but one that is not overdone, leaving the vocals just gently sparkly. The bass is quite full, north of neutral again, and the frequency response is what seems to create the soundstage, of course with the vocals pulled back slightly versus the bass and treble. And what I also noticed is that cymbals have good timbre. Dead Can Dance, on the other hand, was thunderous and just below sibilant, meaning it was quite manageable to listen to. Decay on the vocals is magnificent though, suggesting they are very competent IEMs. Yoko Mabuchi's live jazz tracks were a little bit too spacious in this case, with the bass dominating slightly unnecessarily. And the tips definitely seemed to fix the issues I had with the treble in Singapore. Another brand I discovered is called Tipsy Audio. They have a range of IEMs which I tried basically all of, from the M1 up to the TS12, their flagship. They all have a slight V-tuning to the sound and a design for mixing and mastering. Being somewhat maybe less fancy, they are also less expensive than other brands, and that made for an interesting result. Starting with the M1 single dynamic driver IEMs, Dead Can Dance was open and slightly holographic sounding, and vocals were smooth and nuanced if the decay is quite matched, say, the Moses, which I'd just been listening with. Bass impact was somewhat low. Now the treble was just on the edge of sibilance, and Yoko Mabuchi has very good instrument separation. Delicacy rather than impact. The Carmen Gomez track had more bass impact with a gentle V, almost sibilant I found, but otherwise quite coherent, and considering all this for only $100, I thought that was pretty good. Moving up to the $500 M5, it has a similar tuning but much better dynamics, and the treble I found has zero issues. A great thing because then it allows me to appreciate the music rather than think about the IEMs themselves. Vocals sound warmer but they're still very clear. And the bass was nice and full. Really excellent detail, but slightly fast decay from the Carmen Gomez track. Listening to Yoko Mabuchi, it has very sharp piano notes and the cymbal presentation was quite good. I was pretty impressed for $500. The M3, which is in between the M1 and the M9, has a full bass and sparkly treble with good soundstage, despite the slightly strong bass. Cymbal timbre was a little bit off after listening with the TS12, and speaking of the TS12, and I fitted that with the Baroque stage tips, Yoko Mabuchi had extended piano note decay and much better detail. It's available in a custom or a universal, and I definitely consider one of these as a custom. Trumpet note nuances were very clear, and I didn't have to think about the treble at all, it was that good. And with the cymbal subtleties very clear from each note, I was very impressed for the price, which is a lot lower than you pay for flagships from other brands. One of the IEMs I really wanted to try was the Canpur CP752B. I know this is one of Jude's favourite IEMs, and I was really curious to hear an IEM which he really likes. I found this IEM has excellent mids and treble, but with a bass shelf. Yokomabuchi had good space and generally excellent percussion timbre, not as good detail and decay as I've heard from other top-of-the-line models, but still pretty up there. The bass does very well without interfering on the Carmen Gomez track. It has a very slight sibilance in the vocals, which maybe explains some of my impressions from the Yokomabuchi track. The bass is head shaking on Dead Can Dance with excellent quality. Listening to Summertime from a rip of the Accuphase SACD reveals much about the tuning and decay as well. On to something different, Stax had their setup in the middle of one of the main floors, and I wanted to try their base model SRS 1000 using the RU9 as a single-ended source to the amp because it only has single-ended input. I find them light and airy as expected, and a decent but present bass listening to the Yokomabuchi track. The dynamics are somewhat flat and seem to distort on stronger notes, which is something not so surprising given that electrostatic headphones really need serious amplification to work really well. Dead Can Dance, for example, had low bass but good clarity, and the soundstage was a bit flat. Some blur and a bit closed in, although some of the closed in sound was probably because the single-ended output of Cayenne devices tend to have higher crosstalk. Once again, I tried Brise's Fugaku as the most expensive IEMs you can buy, actually a whole IEM system. My desire to have these as the best thing I ever heard was pretty high, and it didn't quite make it there. And I really wanted to like these IEMs, and really they do perform excellently, but not at a vastly greater price than you can buy a good DAP or a Hugo 2 and a good pair of high-end IEMs. Now, the last time I'd used them was using a single-ended to balance converter from the Hugo 2, and I wondered if that had been a factor of my impressions. But this time with a Cayenne from the balanced output, I still had similar impressions of how they performed. They still sounded like they had some of the balanced armature kind of resonance, but otherwise they are extremely competent, but I felt that other top-of-the-line IEMs had more detail overall. Still one of the best I've ever heard with Dead Can Dance. I hadn't had a chance to really listen to the Yamaha YH5000 SEs again, and with a lot of impressions online and measurements and whatnot and discussion, that's one of those headphones I really wanted to explore again. Now, for all the crap they have been receiving for having a slightly odd frequency response, arguably the soundstage is a bit small, but the imaging is otherwise very good. That Summertime track from the Accuphase SACD suggests treble quality is imperfect though, with some of the note nuance was missing. But in the end, they sounded too closed in and really don't have enough detail for a flagship pair of headphones. Audio-Technica had the ADX 7000s in the only private room available at the show, but with a custom setup using a Cord DAC 64, which is actually quite old, to a Mascobo 475 amplifier, which is excellent, also with Brise cables. I'd probably say the overall setup was limited by the DAC, which shows how competent they are, say, listening to Bill Evans. Now, they're somewhat of a neutral monitor in terms of how they're tuned, but in a sense, they do get out of the way of the music to a strong degree. John Mellencamp, for example, was accurate, with the bass hits floating out into the soundstage. The grittiness of his vocals were very clear. Listening to Bonobo's Black Sands was like listening to a movie in surround. Mark Ribot, one of my favourite guitarists, suggests a slightly rolled off treble and noticeable mid-bass. Nuances were maybe only behind Focal's Utopias, though I'd have to actually try that in my own system to be sure. The clicker in that track had a distinct detail to each click. From the Philippines comes Flipears, and listening to their prototype flagship, it has something of an L tuning that is basically neutral but with a boosted bass. I found that the Yokomabuchi track came through with a good amount of space and plenty of nuance with percussion, and notably the percussion timbre was excellent. Maybe only the last bit of decay lacking compared to other flagships I've had, but still. Drum hits, if strong, on, say, Sinner's Prayer from Carmen Gomez were detailed, and the vocal detail was excellent. Maybe a touch of sibilance on some notes, but otherwise excellent dynamics. I reckon for my preferences the mid-bass could come back a decibel or two only. Listening to the Aegis, the entry-level IM with bone conductor drivers, it was actually very good with Carmen Gomez, even after listening with the new flagship, just not as spacious or detailed. John Mellencamp came through a little bit tizzy with a narrower soundstage, with a good separation all things considered. The Astra IM. Listening again to Carmen Gomez, there was a slight V, and an emotional experience which was good, like you were hearing between the notes, with a long cymbal decay. There was a weird vibration at the start of the Mark Ribot track. Otherwise excellent timbre. Brings out the feeling of the music very well, although I need to try with better gear to really appreciate they're capable of. Lastly, I tried Sennheiser's HDB630 Bluetooth headphones with the Bluetooth dongle from my phone. Listening to Mark Ribot was actually surprisingly good, and percussion sounded real and even had a bit of decay and echo considering all the digital processing going on. And the soundstage was very good. A reasonable amount of instrument separation was perceivable. The bass was a bit elevated, not surprisingly for consumer headphones, but not enough to interfere with the rest of the music. Whatever setting they were on, they let through voices very slightly when no music was playing. Listening to something different, Liz writes Your Love, which is a more modern track. Bass was a bit woolly, but the kick drum had some detail. Congestion was inevitable in busy passages, considering all things, but it wasn't blurry and clarity was maintained sufficiently. All in all, certainly pretty excellent for a pair of Bluetooth headphones. HiFiMan had their HE1000 and Arya Wi-Fi models on display. Available only in Asia at the moment, they have a Himalaya architecture-based DAC and amp built in, which can accept streams from Tidal, Roon, Spotify and Qobuz, and will be available in Western markets in the future. So that wraps it up for my impressions from the earphone Potafes last year. If you have any IMs you think I should have listened to, or headphones, at the next time I go to a Can Jam or other event, do let me know in the comments below. And do let me know if you've tried any of the IMs or headphones that I mentioned in this report and what you think of them. As always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to chatting with you online or seeing you at a Can Jam.